Welcome to Euros Hartley's Finding the Front, where we get to know the people who front some of Western Australia's leading companies, providing you with real insights into the way they think and approach things, both in business and in life. So get the volume adjusted in your car or your headphones sorted and settle in for a great story. Here's your host, Tim Banfield.
Hey everyone, and thanks for tuning in to another episode of Euros Hartley's Finding the Front. Euros Hartley's is a proudly Western Australian financial services company. If you'd like to learn more about the services we provide, please don't hesitate to contact us or visit our website at www.euroshartleys.com. Well, our awesome guest on this episode is a person who has built a career on passion and leadership in the field of mining, in the country of Namibia in Southern Africa, in the commodity of uranium. Our guest is Mr. Brandon Munro, the Chief Executive Officer of Bannerman Energy, stock code BMN. Brandon has 25 years experience both as a corporate lawyer and resources executive. He is a prominent leader within the uranium sector and is currently a member of the World Nuclear Association's Director General's Advisory Council. Brandon served as a co-chair of the World Nuclear Association's Nuclear Fuel Demand Working Group for 4 years and was an expert contributor on uranium to the UN Economic Commission for Europe. This is an absolute cracker. So without further ado, it gives me an immense pleasure to introduce to Euros Hartley's Finding the Front, the CEO of Bannerman Energy and all-round great guy, Mr. Brandon Munro. Hi, Brandon, and thanks very much for joining us on Euros Hartley's Finding the Front. It's really good to have you on. It's such a great story, this, and so much to capture in what we have a short space of time, really. But look, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks, Tim.
Good on you. Apart from you being the MD and CEO of uranium company Bannerman Energy, and also, amongst other things, part of the World Nuclear Association, this is a really interesting story because you were born in South Africa and then you made your way across to Australia. Now, just start this little bit out and we'll go from there because it all ties back in.
Look, it does tie back in, and it's interesting how working in Namibia has enabled me to close the loop in many respects on that. So my folks, they met in London. My dad was third generation South African, originally from Scotland, his family. And my mum was, I don't know, fifth or sixth generation Australian. She loves to remind me of that. And they met in London, they came down to South Africa, and for a brief period of time they married there and lived there and had myself and my sister. And then we came out to Australia when I was very young. So my mum was always absolutely insistent that we were Australian. She marched from the hospital straight to the embassy and registered as an Australian citizen like the day we were born. And that was our identity. So we've never had an identity as South African. However, we went back there a lot as kids. All of my dad's side of the family is still there. And that created a real sense of belonging there that's difficult to describe because there's no education, there's no living there, but there is a sense that you get when you get off the plane that it feels like a real part of your life. And so then to be able to subsequently live there was an amazing experience.
This is really interesting. It's part of Finding the Front is understanding the background of our guests and how that's been really formative in the career and life path that you've subsequently taken. That's really interesting because for the listener, we'll see that Brandon has become very much entrenched in Namibia through business, but also through his love of the country. And yeah, it's a fascinating story. We'll just start out though. When you did arrive in Australia, you started out with primary schooling in New South Wales and Queensland. Is that right?
Yeah, predominantly New South Wales. So I think I turned 3 in Australia, and my folks, they started in Newcastle, a little corner on Lake Macquarie, which was quite idyllic actually. You go back there and later in life and you think, wow, that was a pretty nice place to grow up.
Yeah,
we had heaps of freedom. We lived 5 doors down from an enormous area of bushland, and it was in the days where you'd remember this, Tim, you could go off and you were basically given the instructions that if you weren't back by dark, you weren't going to get dinner, and that was about the extent of the boundaries for it.
Yeah.
So we spent hours exploring in the bush there, and that's how we entertained ourselves, and that really contributed, I think, to a sense of imagination, a sense of creativity, and something that these days I really worry for with my own kids, because the environment's just so different these days.
Yeah.
But that was the way we grew up. It was a really lovely little community tucked away on the side of Newcastle that tended to be where a lot of the professionals lived, and so it was a good school, a very strict school. You know, we had to have our shoes shined, and we sang both God Save the Queen and the national anthem every day at assembly.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Gosh. But your mum was a teacher also, I understand.
Yeah. So mum was a teacher. She's always taken it super seriously. And education was like the guiding star for us when we were kids.
Yes, yes. And what about your dad?
Interesting story. He's come from a couple of families in South Africa which were very well to do. And his father had most of his money in Namib tin mines, which with his twin brother, so my father's uncle, they owned the Oist tin mine in Namibia. And they lost it all in 1949 when my great uncle was killed in his own private plane. And papers were never found, and basically the family lost everything. So
just to pause there, this was your father's father owned the tin mine?
Him and his brother.
Him and his brother, right.
Which subsequently became the
world's... In Namibia?
It became the world's largest hard rock tin mine.
My goodness.
It was small scale at that stage. It was only in the 60s that ISCOR got hold of it and developed it, and it's now owned by Andrada, which is a UK-listed company. But the impact of that was at the age of 7, my father's family went from being kind of high society type people in South Africa to needing to move in with the in-laws. And that just had a big impact on my father. And it happened second time around because in those days, if you left South Africa, you couldn't take anything with you.
Right.
So again, when we started, they started from the bottom and started from scratch. And I suppose the impact that it had was that my dad was always quite conservative. So he came to Australia, they had to start from scratch again, saved very, very hard. He was incredibly disciplined. He worked very, very hard. And the entrepreneurial gene clearly skipped a generation, but might have come back with a little bit of vigour.
Well, we're about to find that out. It's really interesting, though, when you look at that. Did your dad enjoy what he did when he came to Australia in terms of he was in insurance?
Yeah, an insurance broker.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, he did. You know, it was an opportunity for him to get on his feet straight away.
Yes.
So in those days, I think the story goes they arrived on the weekend and he got a job on the Friday. So he immediately found his feet. He immediately plugged straight into a network. That was important, and just got on with what was important to people in that stage, which was being a breadwinner and getting your start in a new country.
Yes.
Now, my mum was a teacher, so she could plug in quite easily. And that was my upbringing. Both parents worked. We certainly didn't spend any money on anything remotely unnecessary. And, you know, you'd remember it in those days, you earned your pocket money and you got your absolute basics from your parents, and anything additional to that, you either waited to birthday or Christmas or you strived for it.
That's exactly right. It clearly had an impact on you. So you moved to Perth at some point and you end up going to Wesley College here in Perth. Now, you got to Wesley College on the back of a scholarship. So clearly the impact of I'd say your mother, in terms of her urging you to be strong with your education, but she also got you involved in music.
Yeah, the primary school that I went to in New South Wales, it was called Valentine Primary.
Yes.
So, I suppose with a name like that, it's always going to be a bit arty-farty, but they had an incredible concert band. It was just one of these freak of nature things where a Greek immigrant school teacher called Geet Ulanis was a fanatic about the concert band. And in other respects, it was a relatively normal school, apart from the discipline that I talked about, but it had a concert band, a primary school concert band of more than 100 students. And it practiced every day. So Monday to Friday, you got to school at 7 o'clock in the morning and you put out an hour or so of practice in the band before you got started.
Unbelievable.
It was. I mean, it really was tremendous. It had all sorts of accolades that had been going for a while, and I think it won some big national concert band competition and that sort of thing. Now, I was lucky enough to be able to play saxophone in that band, and it just meant that as a small kid, I actually got quite good at it. And put a little bit of practice on top of that, and you develop quickly. And the nice thing was, because it was so structured, I have no memories of my parents nagging me about practice or anything like that. So there was none of the negatives that many parents associate with a kid who takes on music, who isn't self-motivated enough to just run with it.
Yeah. But that gave you the start, which was formative, really. I mean, it's one of the, I suppose, gifts that came out of your primary schooling was your ability to play the saxophone. And I don't know, and how did you end up in Perth? How did your family transfer across?
Yeah, so my dad moved out of insurance broking for a period of time and went and worked for Dun & Bradstreet.
Yes.
Back in the days when you didn't have Google, so business information and intelligence was a valuable thing that you paid firms for. And he was transferred then to Queensland and then quite quickly to Western Australia.
Right.
And so we came across when I was 11. I talked about my mum and education. You know, the house hunting process basically started working out where the catchments were for the top government schools,
right,
the high schools, and then you started to work out which of those suburbs you can afford, and then you worked out which house you could afford in those suburbs.
Yes.
And that's how we went house hunting.
Yeah.
So they bought a house in Bull Creek, which was zoned for Rossmoyne High School, which still to this day is an excellent school, but it had a fantastic music program. And so I went and played in the high school band and went touring with kids who were a lot older than me and that sort of stuff. But that just gave me a little bit of an extension on the saxophone. And then 1987, I was all set to go to Rossmoyne. I was quite comfortable with that. Again, it was a great school. It was a difficult time in Perth, as you'd well remember. And in fact, my dad wasn't even in work at that stage. He'd been a bit of a casualty of what had happened in Western Australia. And so the idea of going to a private school like Wesley was just, wasn't even a thought process. But I went and sat the test and then also played the saxophone for them and managed to get this opportunity with the scholarship, which in itself was still tough because it was only a 50% scholarship. They didn't offer 100% scholarships.
Right.
And I had a sister who was also going to go to a private school. So my folks reminded me that it was 150% of the cost of going to a private school.
Well, Wesley helped out with a little bit, really.
Yeah.
But it's still a good story in terms of, how that start back in Newcastle and where it ended up. What a great result.
Yeah, and it's one of those, music's been amazing for me, and I'm really pleased that my daughters are playing music now, and there's so much evidence that it's great for the development of the brain. If you get an instrument that gives you a lot of latitude, like a saxophone, it's fantastic for creative endeavours. And I went on to play jazz, and that's a sort of different realm altogether in terms of the intellect required with music. So it's just a beautiful thing, music with kids.
Thanks for sharing that. So how did you find school generally? Did you excel or did you find it tough or?
I loved it.
Loved it?
Look, in those days in particular, the academic process in school was very narrow. And I just had a brain that responded to that form of thinking, that form of intelligence. I don't think it was the right way of teaching kids at all. And I think we've probably still got a long way to go. But in my circumstances, it was bang on. And I was good at maths and I found all of that stuff pretty easy. So really enjoyed the competitiveness of school, and I did enjoy the fact that I didn't really have to do much to do well with grades, and that gave me the latitude to do a lot of sport, to do a lot of music, to put my hand up for everything else that came along. And, really I feel like I took every opportunity that I got at a pretty privileged school as Wesley was and still is.
Excellent. Tell me, Brandon, did you know or have any inkling about what you wanted to pursue in life in terms of a career at that point?
Oh, yeah. I had a very brief period of thinking I might want to be a fireman, and that finished at about the age of 6 when I discovered the word entrepreneur and my dad explained what it really meant. And then I just didn't bother thinking about anything else after that. So I locked onto that, and do you remember the show with Michael J. Fox in it that had him as
Family Ties?
That's it, yeah. So I used to watch that and think, yeah, that's me. I wasn't too sure of his dress sense in those days, but that's just how I imagined it would be.
Classic. Well, I'll tell you what, you did pretty well, and you went out and you started with the University of WA to do a double degree, economics, quantitative economics and law. which is no mean feat. And you went through there, and then you did postgraduate diplomas with FINSIA and the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Was that goal with your post-schooling studies, your tertiary studies, was that to drive you towards that entrepreneurial spirit that you had? Or did you, law, economics, did you have that sort of bent to go into companies?
When I left school, I certainly didn't have my heart set on being a lawyer. I knew it was a reasonable option. I knew what I didn't want to do. I went and did some work experience in a hospital and very quickly ruled out going down that path, being a doctor or a health professional. And I chose that double degree for its diversity rather than being more complementary like law commerce, which was what a dyed in the yarn wannabe a lawyer type student would choose.
Yes.
So I thought, well, maybe I like law and maybe I like economics, and they're reasonably diverse and they both create skills and experience and knowledge that leads in that path of being an entrepreneur. By the time I left uni, I realised that being a lawyer for a period of time is a pretty good business apprenticeship. It offered some advantages. It gives you a lot of risk tolerance because you've got something of a safety net to fall back on. So I had a pretty loose plan, which was work as a lawyer in the right field for long enough to become useful, as in you've actually got some skills that add value in the real world, and it takes quite a few years in law to do that, and try as best as I could to be at the coalface of what was being done so that I would understand the business of it, not the law of it, and then be in a position where if it all went horribly wrong when I went out on my own, at least I could go back and be a lawyer.
Yes.
And a lot of entrepreneurs would tell you that that's exactly the wrong way to do. You've got to go all in. You've got to be fully committed. But interestingly, after I stopped working as a lawyer, the prospect of going back to it was motivating in itself, because I knew that I didn't want to feel like I was going backwards in that way.
Yes, yes. Well, when you left uni, I will just add, you did go on and do an executive education leadership development program at the Melbourne University. So you rounded all that out over a period of time. Do you still look at education as important in your career now? Like, do you have ambition to continue to grow on that path, or it's all practical and you're in the system?
Look, continuing to grow is absolutely essential.
Yes.
One of the very most important filters that I use when I'm building teams is fixed mindset versus growth mindset. And so you've got to absolutely have a growth mindset if you want to go anywhere these days. If for no other reason that the world is just spinning so fast around us that if you think you can stop, the world will move around you and you just won't be able to keep up.
Yes.
Education comes in many forms, and I feel like I've filled in some key gaps in terms of formal education that you mentioned, but the growing can take many different forms. And I think the metric that I use is I like to look back 3 years and 5 years, and if I don't feel that myself 3 and 5 years ago was terribly naive, then I haven't grown enough in the intervening period. I like to look back specifically at things that I did at that period. And if I don't think, if you don't feel at least a little bit of cringe about what you were doing then it means you're not growing fast enough.
It's very well put, very well put. So when you left uni, what were the other jobs you were doing?
At uni, I was really lucky because I'd done a lot of speaking and I'd done a little bit of drama. And so I did these interesting things like host murder mystery nights. So,
You're kidding.
Yeah. And that was brilliant. It was so much better than waiting on tables, right?
Yeah.
It was fun. I got to meet interesting people. I got paid quite well for it. I taught debating, all of that sort of stuff. And one thing leads to another, So,
and these were paid jobs.
Yeah. But and in those days when you did articles, so I think your question was what did I do straight from uni, and I went and did articles, but you were so poorly paid as an articled clerk in those days, you needed a second job. So I continued doing it for about 2 years on the weekend.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Gosh, the things you learn. Well, let's just fast track into your first job. So your first real job was with Cause Chambers Westgarth as a lawyer, and I understand it was under the M&A lawyer Ian Cochrane, who was quite well known, of course. Tell us a little bit about that, because you, as you say, you weren't paid a huge amount, but the learning curve would have been enormous.
Yeah, exactly. So I only applied for one job coming out of uni, and that was to work for Ian.
Right.
I'd done a couple of clerkships at the firm. I'd done some clerkships at other firms, and what became apparent to me in those days is the very big firms, if you like, the top tier firms in those days, they had big things going on, big acquisitions if you were working in their corporate department, or big litigations if you're working their litigation. And I took a look at that and I could see that coming out of uni, you might be doing 2 weeks of due diligence of the most banal, boring stuff that you could possibly imagine. And with what I'd been doing for the last 5 years, that was like so far from what could excite me that I was very selective, and I realised that Ian wasn't doing quite such big work. His clients were the entrepreneurs. They weren't middle-level management of Telstra, for example, who was giving a whole lot of instructions to a Freehills or a Mallisons or one of these other big firms. And after working in the firm on a couple of vacation clerkships, I came to understand that this is a firm that you're dealing with the people who are making the decisions, who've grown the business. And in Ian's case, he'd had these clients over many, many years where he'd really become their trusted counsel, not just the lawyer who does stuff or executes stuff, but the person who is the first call that they'll make outside of their organisation when they're thinking about what to do.
Yeah.
And for me, that was going to be the perfect business apprenticeship, and it was. So I made one application. All of my friends thought I was absolutely nuts. It was in the days where only 50% of lawyers got jobs, and everyone was running around like crazy trying to create fodder on their CVs to make themselves look more brilliant than they were. And I just thought, right, well, if it's meant to be, it's meant to be. And if I don't get this one job, then I'll skip the whole legal thing and I'll go straight into business somehow.
But you got it. And
yeah,
away
I got
you
it
went.
and had a fantastic career, really, being mentored by Ian. And many of the listeners will know he very sadly passed away a couple of years ago, way too young. But he had a profound influence on me throughout my career, well beyond the times that I was working for him, and something that I'm eternally grateful for.
You were there for 3 years, thereabouts?
3 years, and then I followed Ian to Mallisons.
Right, okay, and then they were there for another 2 years. So you were a mergers and acquisitions lawyer at Mallisons.
Yeah.
With Ian again.
Yes, and a much bigger team by then, who were about 8 corporate partners.
Right.
Mallisons really dominated the scene in Western Australia for corporate and M&A.
Tell me, Brandon, with that part of your life, you know, when you look at that, did it set you up for the basis of understanding where you are now in terms of companies and the structure of companies and the way that companies unfold, whether it be through corporate transactions or corporate growth, that sort of thing? Did it really give you the basis for where you are now, do you think?
Yeah, it did. Like if you look at my CV, it doesn't necessarily have a very clear thread through it. It reads a bit more like a choose your own adventure.
Yes.
But the common thread throughout my CV is equity capital markets.
Yes.
And so the work that I did in that period and the subsequent work that I did gave me a really deep understanding of how the ASX works. As a lawyer, you're spending half your time trying to formulate ways of doing things and half your time digging clients out who've done it wrong. And that's how you really learn about this. You learn about how top companies operate, how small companies operate. You learn why West Perth sometimes has a bad reputation in other parts of the world for what's done. You see the good, the bad, but certainly you see the ugly as a lawyer, not necessarily for your own clients, but sometimes your own clients are impacted by behaviour and conduct and steps taken by other parties. So it means that later in my career, I understand what to watch out for. I understand what unscrupulous people are capable of, what they might be angling for. It gives you a much deeper understanding of how the capital markets work. And coming from a broking firm, you and all of your colleagues and the people around you might take for granted that you've got this deep understanding because you're in there every day. But for someone who needs to do other things in their day, like manage a company, it's certainly not something that comes automatically.
Yes. Good tip for budding business entrepreneurs to get a law base.
Yeah, but this is a very specific part of the field.
Yes, in the M&A field.
M&A, but also working in small to medium organisations. Because if you're doing M&A and you're only working for ASX 200 companies, at best you're dealing with the company secretary.
Right.
at worst you're dealing with middle management, and occasionally you're getting a look in on a board if you're very senior. If you're the partner of the firm, then you're going to be sitting around those tables. But if you're towards the bottom of the structure, it's not quite that experience. So that's where I was just really fortunate. In the early formulative parts of my career, I got access to those thinkers, access to the entrepreneurs, directly involved in them. Ian had a real rule, which is if you came into a meeting, you did not open your mouth except to answer the pleasantries at the beginning. So he just wouldn't let you speak. But it meant that I sat there and I listened.
And you listened, yeah.
And I observed and I learnt a lot.
This pattern of learning continues on. One of the roles you ended up taking was post that legal base was as a corporate executive for GRD Limited, which at the time was an ASX 200 company. It's a pretty important part because it's a pivotal part in terms of you deciding or getting a feel for the renewable space, which I think is very pertinent when we look at where you are now in uranium with a very strong influence in nuclear. So could you just give us a little bit of a background there on your role with GRD? So coming out of Mallisons at that time and then into that role.
It was a fantastic opportunity because GRD was very corporately active at that stage, and they'd made a decision that in the holding company they wanted to set up a bit of a SWAT team, and they needed a M&A lawyer there. I'd worked for them and I'd worked with them already, so
Right.
I knew a bit about the organisation, and I understood that with the transactions that they were doing, I'd have one foot firmly in what I'd been doing in corporate law, whether it's a float of a new company or an M&A transaction, but I'd be able to put the other foot into the commercial side of things that I'd seen across the table but never been responsible for as a lawyer. So for me, that looked perfect. And that's exactly what we did. So as soon as I got in there, the first thing we did was a private equity investment to fund the Eastern Creek Waste Management Facility for Global Renewables, which was the renewables business that they had. Now, that part of the renewables business was all about waste management and extracting value in its various forms from basically what gets put in the bin.
Yes.
And we had quite a long history and a successful history with that business, but they had other aspects of renewable energy, such as landfill gas to methane. When I joined the company, they'd actually traded 5% of the world's carbon credits in that very nascent phase of carbon trading.
That would have been almost pioneering.
Yeah, it was. And we'd had a deep dive on solar and wind and other aspects of renewables, and at that stage decided not to invest. And that was instructive because as much as it was a very optimistic time for what renewables could do at that point, it was informative as to there are limitations and there will always be limitations. And we needed to project a long way into the future at that point as to which of those limitations would be solved and how they would be solved and what the alternatives might be and what the threats might be. And it was in that period of time that I met a couple of colleagues who had been involved in the nuclear industry overseas and started to debase a lot of the myths that had been presented to me as facts during school and just growing up in Australia in that era.
It's probably not a bad point to touch on that. At that point, what was because you're now entrenched in this industry so well, right? But just here we are at about 2005, 2004. So you left school, you've gone into law, you've come out, and now you're dealing and getting an understanding for renewable energy, and in this case, waste recovery, and then learning a little bit about nuclear. Prior to this, what was your view on nuclear? What did you learn? What did they teach you at school? What was your overall perception of nuclear at this point?
Well, that it was evil, that we were really fortunate and proud to be in a country that didn't have any nuclear energy. I can remember getting I think it was a textbook, I can still picture it in my mind, and this is from primary school.
Yes.
Showing which countries had nuclear reactors and which countries didn't. And I think the next page was which countries were communist and which ones weren't.
Right.
And that's what we learned. And we had no reason to challenge that for years. So I just went on and just tucked that away in my little memory bank of what's real in the world and what's not. And it was only in my 20s that I had even the first opportunity to start asking questions of what had been
Which is
taught
about
to me.
here, about at this role.
Yeah, it was about that. It wasn't connected directly with work. It was actually a friend of mine had done a PhD on high-level waste storage. A chap called Richard Price, super brainy. He's actually a Bannerman shareholder, I'm very proud to say. And for the first time, him presenting a speech that I listened to, it was like, well, hang on a sec, that doesn't really make sense with everything that I know about this industry. And so I chatted to him a bit about it and realised that a lot of what I'd been told just simply wasn't correct. And then that sparked a bit of an interest, and about that time Paladin was taking off. So a lot of the conversations I was having with stockbrokers and others were, did you buy a Paladin at 4 cents or did you buy a Paladin at 8 cents? And then the next time you'd catch up, it'd be, geez, did you sell at 12 cents or did you hold for 24 cents? And it was a really exciting time that made uranium and nuclear a little bit more mainstream in general conversation.
What years were we there when Richard released that paper?
Oh, probably about 2001, 2002.
Okay,
thereabouts.
right. So that's just prior to you being with GRD. So
Yep.
I got it. So that was a really formative point. And then as you learnt more about nuclear through GRD, the penny started to drop. Would that be fair to say? And is in where you wanted to start directing your efforts?
Yeah, and in an interesting way, because the chairman of GRD was anti-nuclear, and I think still probably is. So a lot of it was different executives in the company wanting to make sure that I had a balanced view of it.
Right.
So it's not that the company was pro-nuclear, the company was pro-renewables, but there were guys in there who they were extraordinarily successful in their fields, in their various things, like Dr. John White, for example, who'd done some amazing things in industry, but he'd also had exposure overseas to nuclear energy and had a realistic view of it back in those days.
You went on from GRD and you went into St George Capital. You also worked with Cochrane Lishman on the client side M&A work, which was, I think, coming back to your background and you're establishing that understanding of how equity capital markets work. The time at Cochrane Lishman would have been very formative as well. It continued the growth path.
Yeah, and it again, in terms of using a basis in legal knowledge and legal experience to expand into commercial. So an example of what I did that seems to join the dots in my career was I was seconded into a client which was about $1 billion company that was being run by Len Jubber, who became my boss at Bannerman when I joined the company. I'd got to know Len at Oceana Gold, Macrae's gold mine in those days. Which
was part of GRD?
Correct, yeah.
Yep.
And so one of the things that I did was manage the float of that in 2004. So Perilli was looking at M&A, and I went in really as the seconded business development manager to assist them with that, interfacing back into Cochrane Lishman, who were appointed as the M&A and defence lawyers. And that was a really good experience because I got to see how companies from formulation upwards start to think about M&A, and was in all of the board meetings because I would report on it to the board, and had a very good experience that later set me up for understanding a different dimension of M&A and how companies compare organic versus acquisitive growth and so on.
You were there for, well, a little over a year, fair to say, and then you ended up going, well, overseas. You saw an opportunity, and this is where life gets pretty interesting for you, I must say. But was that about right with Cochrane Lishman? You were there for about a year?
Yeah, I was consulting to them on a part-time basis.
Right.
So I was doing other things at the time. I was doing some property development, and
this entrepreneur coming out on you?
Yeah, it was time to start swinging the bat. So it served me really well. It gave me borrowing capacity, which in those days with trying to develop stuff was really important.
Yes.
And it also meant that I had time to do some other things. And amongst that, myself with 3 partners, we'd been working for about 2.5 years to negotiate the acquisition of a business in Czech Republic. And so after 2.5 years and having Ernst & Young in Prague engaged on our behalf.
In Prague, right.
We realised that there was a point where we hit a wall. We just couldn't get the counterparty to move. And we got the feedback that they didn't think we were serious. because we're all the way in Perth. And this is something that's true of many, many listed companies who, for example, try and run a business in Africa from West Perth. You've got to be there. So as soon as we got that memo, I said, okay, well, what about if I pack up my life and I go there? Do you think that'll move them? And they said, yeah. And within a month of arriving in Prague, I was sitting in the chairman's office and we signed the documents off, and then we had a process of buying this business, which involved then the due diligence and obtaining finance.
So you went and moved to Prague, negotiated the deal on this business, and spent 2.5 years there.
Yeah, so it wasn't quite the fairy tale that I thought I was going for. In many respects it was, but...
Because it sounds like a bit of a dream, really, going and living in Prague for a couple of years and running a business you're looking at acquiring.
So that part sounds great, right?
Yeah.
But you've got to remember, this is late 2007. We completed the due diligence condition in December 2007, and we had some ideas on finance, which all got eradicated by the GFC.
Okay. Yeah.
And the business that we were buying it off the equivalent of an AMP. It was owned by Vienna Insurance Group, which was this massive insurance group in Czech Republic. And the only reason they even had this business is because it had a large property holding in the third largest city in Czech Republic. So it was on their books as a property company. It took us 6 months to convince them that they even owned it.
How did you identify it?
There was a listed company that had a joint venture with them, and that's what piqued my interest. I'd been going backwards and forwards to Czech Republic a bit. It had always fascinated me. I'd first gone there straight after uni in 1997, and I saw it as a really interesting market. And what this was, it was the former Czech geological brigade from communist times that had reinvented itself, that had a few it was a conglomerate of a few cash-making businesses. It had the second largest environmental remediation business in Czech Republic at a time when the EU was shelling heaps of cash at new aspirants. Bulgaria was coming into the EU, and countries that had had a lot of Soviet-era mess that they needed to clean up. And it had a 55-year-old analog database because the Czechs were really well regarded as scientists.
Yes. And
this organisation had been, countries from Yemen to Ukraine to Mongolia had outsourced their geotechnical and geological work to this organisation over the years in the Soviet sphere. So they had this basement that was just full of data that they didn't quite know what to do with. So myself and 3 partners, we thought, well, if we could buy this business, break it up, sell off the different units where they could be a bit more focused on their own heavy engineering or geotechnical studies for highways and these sort of businesses, they can go off and do their own thing. And the idea was that we'd be left with the database and the environmental remediation business. And because of the work I'd done with global renewables, I knew that I could plug them into some sort of Western technologies and use that as a business that could really grow into this EU funding.
Wow.
But it didn't work.
Okay.
But it was just as well, because if we'd completed before the GFC, the debt that we would have been carrying to buy that business would have just about strangled me. So it was one of those experiences where I didn't mope around for very long after I realised that we'd dodged a bullet there.
Interesting. Another learning curve. I will note, Brandon, during this period of time in Prague, you reached the pinnacle of your sporting career, in your words. When chatting offline, here you are, you've become captain of the Prague Cricket Club, and you captained them to a trifecta of trophies in the Czech European League, which is Eastern European League, which in itself I didn't know existed. But here we are, we've got a famous face in the room.
and I tell you, it doesn't get more famous than that. I discovered there is a thing called a flicks wicket, which is something that the ICC developed, which is basically like a roll-out piece of plastic that has got little cells that's designed to create bounce for a cricket ball.
Right.
And if you start with a pretty flat oval and you put this roll-out wicket, it's not too bad. The only problem is, the only place we could find as the Prague Cricket Club to set ourselves up on the weekend was used during winter as a lacrosse field. And so it was utterly pockmarked. And so you'd roll this wicket out and someone could bowl a ball at exactly the same length, and depending on whether it hit one of these pockmarks or hit a piece of hard mud, it'd either fly at your ankle or fly at your face. And I was a keeper as well, so I used to stand up to the stumps to the medium paces, and oh my goodness, that was adrenaline filled.
You had your work cut out.
Had my work, and every so often we'd go on tour and we'd go to a country like France where we could find a super turf wicket, like not a turf wicket, but one of those AstroTurf wickets. Yeah. And everyone would be dreaming of it for nights leading up to it. We're going to get to play on a true wicket. This is going to be incredible. It's going to be amazing. So anyway, it was a really fun time, and we toured and we won a event called the Velden Sixes, which was a six-a-side competition in Austria. And we all went down there, and we'd been playing there. The club had been playing there for years, and it was the holy grail. And we played an Italian team in the final that hadn't lost a wicket the whole competition. Their opening batsmen were both South African students who'd played South African under-21s.
So they could play. They
could really play. And I mean, and it wasn't a big field, so they didn't really worry too much about the ball bouncing before it went over the fence, you see. So one of the shots was so big, it broke a light in the car park across the road from the cricket field, right? So these guys could really play.
They had some power.
And we won in the final, so that was like one of the most triumphant moments.
Oh, congratulations. Jeez, that is huge. Okay, well, life gets pretty exciting from there. We move on, and you've just then gone on, subsequently to not getting this deal in Prague, you've then gone on to take on a role, and I would say that's where Len comes back into play with Bannerman Resources, the first time you start employment with Bannerman Resources in 2009, which ultimately, Brandon, you lived in Namibia for this period of time for some 5-6 years. And this is a really interesting point, because if we come right back, this is where we talk about where you were born and where your family grew up, and the tin mine, and here you are back in Namibia in a general manager role. Now, just give us a bit of an insight into how you were thinking here. And given what we've talked about, your understanding of renewables, you touched on nuclear. Bannerman was in the uranium space. How did you feel, and where was this going to go?
So interestingly, I came back from Prague in August 2009, and I'd already been working on a few potential transactions in the rare earth space. So people who remember those days, it was later that year that rare earth went absolutely nuts. There was a Chinese policy decision, and everything started to take off. Now, myself and a couple of colleagues, we'd recognised that well in advance, and we'd been looking at different assets. One of the assets that we considered was in Namibia.
Right.
We didn't end up going ahead with it, but in the course of doing some desktop due diligence, I became really interested in the mining code and the country and it stable rule of law, and all of the things that I talk to investors about now were obvious then, plus the family connection that you mentioned. And so I thought to myself, now that's a place that would be really interesting to get to know properly. So I started going through the metaphorical Rolodex, right, to say, well, who do I know who's working in Namibia? I'm about to come back to Australia. I've got a blank canvas in terms of what I need to do. And Len Jabber's name popped up at Bannerman Resources, and I thought, oh, well, that'll be good. So phoned him up and I said, look, I'm at a loose end. Just let me know if you come across anything you'd like me to do in Namibia for you. And he said, what are you doing on Tuesday? Come and talk to the team. And Bannerman at that stage was fairly advanced on its environmental impact assessment. And they thought it'd be quite handy to have me go up there and just pull it all together and make sure that the consultants, weren't doing too many science experiments up there, and that the leadership in country had the right corporate lens when they were looking at that type of thing. And so I said, yeah, sure, we'll do a 3-month consultancy. And I got to about halfway in that consultancy and I loved it so much that I said to Len, well, look, why don't you bring me on staff?
And that was the start of it.
Yep.
So Bannerman floated on the ASX in 2005. correct?
Yep.
Yeah. So that was a 20-cent listing price. And so by the time you'd arrived, it was 2009. How was the stock going at that point?
Well, I can answer that very clearly because we were trading at about $1.20. We'd been right up. Like, I think in 2006, someone tells me that Bannerman was like the best performing float on the ASX, or it did some spectacular things. And uranium had been beaten up a little bit in the meantime, and so it had come back to about $1.20. And what then happened was in 2011, Fukushima came along, and that, of course, ended up being a very deep and destructive bear market for the company. So much so that by the time I came back in 2016, we were trading at 3 cents, which in today's equivalent after a consolidation is the equivalent of 30 cents.
That's a fascinating period of time when you think about it, because during that period, 2009 to 2011, you're getting your feet behind the desk at Bannerman. 2011, Fukushima occurred. And I suppose it stems back a little bit, Brandon, to your earlier point around what you initially thought of with nuclear from what you were taught when you were growing up. Tell us a little bit about Fukushima in terms of the impact of the earthquake and the tsunami on Fukushima in Japan and the flow-on effect into the nuclear industry, such that the perception from the public at large, the general consumers of electricity or power or energy, would say that nuclear was tough. Nuclear, why would we want to go down that path ever again? Because of the danger that it involved. And if we take that to 2016 when you rejoined Bannerman, and I know there's a little bit in between there, but maybe it's just a good spot to cover that because that's right where we are when that occurred, and you were with Bannerman.
Well, like many people, I was watching the TV screens as the tsunami started to roll in, and those first couple of days were all about the tsunami.
Yes.
And then on about day 3, the focus started to turn to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. And I was watching the screen when the hydrogen explosion was interpreted as a nuclear explosion and all of the misinformation started. There were a couple of things that I understood at that stage. So first of all, through a good friend in Southern Africa, I knew that Greenpeace was evaluating its opposition to nuclear energy in the lead up to that period of time. So more recently, they've just quietly slipped away from their opposition to GMO, for example.
Right.
There was a debate going on in Greenpeace as to whether they should do the same with nuclear energy. There was climate change was at the fore. It was global warming in those days, and nuclear power's incredible contribution that is now recognised quite well was understood then. It's just that people had understood that Chernobyl was a very specific set of circumstances. It was human error that was negligent human error, criminally negligent human error, and there hadn't been Fukushima. Now, a couple of things happened once the focus switched from the once-in-a-thousand-year tsunami, which killed 18,000 people, to the nuclear power plant. First of all, it made fantastic media coverage, and the media cycle couldn't have wanted anything better. Widespread death and destruction is one thing, but riling up all of these deep-seated nuclear fears that people have been harbouring since concern for nuclear weaponry in the 50s and the 60s, that's proper media gold. The other thing is Greenpeace realised that this is a funding opportunity, and they proceeded to start exaggerating the impact of it. And there are a whole lot of terribly tragic outcomes from that. The intense overreaction by Japanese authorities that are now well understood. We now well understood that the poor management of the evacuation, the very long period of time before people could return, the panicked way in which elderly people were moved out of the area, the panicked way in which hospitals were evacuated. This is in the context of an incredible natural disaster being the tsunami, where all of the focus suddenly switched to this one nuclear accident that was unfolding. And there's been enough time and enough water under the bridge for people to understand just what a failure of systems and processes both the accident was, but also the response. But, in fairness to all of those officials, they were getting it in stereo from the anti-nuclear groups at the time, who were doing their best to make the entire country and all of its neighbours think that everyone was about to die.
Mm.
And so that was the first thing. And seeing that abrupt switch in Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and others to appreciating the opportunity of the disaster for their agendas, that was informative. Now, the other thing was the industry, who predominantly engineers and scientists, the nuclear industry, they then set about to assess the tangible aspects of this without putting proper regard into the intangible aspects. And the tangible aspects to this day should be an advertisement for how safe nuclear energy is. No one died directly from radiation. There's one contentious example where an employee has been paid compensation for developing cancer that individual claimed was related to radiation exposure. But in the context of 18,000 people dying in a natural disaster where every other energy source in the country saw explosions and other industrial accidents that caused hundreds of deaths, nobody died from nuclear energy.
Right.
That should be a celebration. It should be a triumph. But it wasn't. But the industry took a long time to understand that. And when I started to see that the industry was trying to comfort itself rather than react to the public relations and media disaster that was unfolding, that's when I started to become really concerned about where this was going to go. And that's when I suppose, recognised it for what it was, which was the start of the next bear market and an event that would, over time, fully arrest all of the progress that had been made in nuclear energy over the last 15 years.
When you look at it, the way that it has unfolded, what have been the building steps to confidence coming back into the nuclear market?
So I think it's a couple of things. Like the way that confidence comes into a market with something that's so linked to nationhood such as energy, and in this case nuclear energy, is people assume that it starts with the politicians and works down to their constituency. But because nuclear is so politically charged and such high risk stakes politically, it actually operates the other way around, unfortunately, because that slows it down. So it's only when the policymakers start to understand how important nuclear energy needs to be against the broader goal of decarbonising that information starts to find its way out ultimately into enough of the constituency where the politicians feel brave enough to talk about it.
Right.
We've seen that in the US with bipartisan support. We've seen that in the UK with crossbench and bipartisan support for nuclear energy. And we're finally seeing it in Australia where at least one side of politics is prepared to talk positively about the benefits of nuclear energy in the context of our own energy crisis that's unfolding in Australia. A couple of the key watershed moments, I think, for nuclear energy were 2 years ago at COP26. There was a broader recognition that nuclear must play a role alongside renewables if we're going to have a hope of decarbonising. Now, where that found its way into the policymakers' calculus is that for the first time, a number of countries set hard targets on decarbonisation. So it went from arm waving to 2050, or in China's case, 2060.
Yes.
So someone got the job of figuring out how that was going to be done. And when they started to work on that, the very brutal reality of how incredibly complicated and difficult it is to decarbonise an industrial economy started to become apparent.
Yes.
And that's when policymakers started to realise the irrefutable truth that nuclear energy must play a role in that. Because if it doesn't, the only way of solving for the goal of decarbonisation is industrial destruction. And that's what we're experiencing in Germany at the moment, for example.
Right. Very interesting. So for the listener, Brandon spent 2 years at Bannerman Resources and then went out on his own and started up with Kanini Resources in 2011, which is right around where it was a sort of just a crossover after the Fukushima, was it?
It was a direct result of Fukushima. And I appreciated that with what we wanted to do in Bannerman at that stage. I had a business development role as well as being general manager in country. I appreciated that wasn't going to happen for quite some time
Based
as a result
on
of
the
Fukushima.
result. Yep, got it. I will just sidetrack there, and Kanini Resources was again in Namibia, right? And it was an exploration company for copper and base metals, so not uranium. Just for the listener, let's just maybe look at your understanding of Namibia. Now that you know it as well as you do, and the attraction you had to it in the early days, it's a population of around 3 million people.
Yeah, not even.
Not
It's
even.
Big country, second lowest population density in the world
Yeah,
after Mongolia.
Its main sources of revenue are agriculture, tourism, mining, and mining goes across the base metals and includes uranium.
Yeah, it's famous for diamonds and uranium.
Yeah.
It's got a smattering of other minerals, which is great. You know, it's got a mining industry the country can be particularly proud of, but it's only on the world stage for diamonds and uranium.
With regards to your role with Kanini, I just want to talk about that, Namibia's side of it in the context of the communities. Okay, and that was a really important role with this, and it gave you. If we talk about your growth journey and your learning journey, this added another part to it. You had to deal with the Himba chieftains. Have I got that right?
Yeah.
And is that like a local community, or is it a larger community, or how would you best describe that?
Well, there's 11 different communities in Namibia,
Right.
including 3 white communities and other native or African Namibian communities that have existed in southern Africa over a long period of time. So the Himba are one of those, and they're probably the most remarkable because they're so authentic to their way of life from hundreds of years ago. So to this day, if you go into a remote Himba community, you're probably only going to see 3 compromises with their way of life before Europeans came to southern Africa. Their diet has changed a little bit because of the availability of maize or corn. Some of those people have got cars, and so that changes how they get around.
Yes.
And everybody has a cell phone.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Technology hasn't escaped them.
No, but if you Google Himba, Himba, and look at the images, you'll see that their way of life is still extremely traditional.
Yes.
And when I first went to one of these villages, when I first had to interact with some chiefs, I was actually going up there to resolve a dispute because our foreman, who came from their village, mind you, that they'd recommended we appoint as a foreman because he spoke a little bit of English, he'd got himself in an altercation with one of the other people from the village, and all of a sudden it became our fault. So we kind of realised that we were being tested, and so I got a couple of wise heads to join me. One was a mentor of mine who'd spent probably 20 years as a doctor in that region. So he understood how the people worked and how they thought. And then the other was Mike Leach, who's still on our board as Bannerman, but in those days he was the chairman of Kanini Resources.
Right.
And he was just a wise dude who knew how things worked in Africa. So we went up there to resolve this, and we had all of the chiefs sitting around. And luckily for me, as I rolled into this village, I was just captured by a sense of wonder and awe as to how is it that they were able to resist all of these foreign influences, you know, including the South Africans who are fighting a war up there on the border with Angola. And it got me thinking about what is it about the strength of their character that they've prioritised their culture and their way of life so strongly that they've resisted all of these other incentives that have been thrown their way and all of these other influences, good and bad. And one thing about the people up there is they're incredibly instinctive. You know, I'm used to being ready to defer on instinct to my wife and other women in our community, but these guys are like taking it to the next level. And Mike Leach whispered in my ear just as we were arriving. We just got out of the car, and he said, look, I know you've negotiated a few deals in your time, but just remember, these guys negotiate every day, and for them the prize is survival. So don't think you can out-negotiate a Himba chief. And that was good advice.
Yes.
And it meant that I went in there, and their instincts were that they understood that I really respected what they were doing. And that created a bond that served me really well for the next 5 years amongst them and the other chiefs that I had to deal with. I ended up needing to interact with 5 chiefs across an area of about 600,000 hectares. And these were very powerful people. They had absolute respect from their communities, and their decisions and their word absolutely prevailed. So it was really important to get that right and to build that respect and build that understanding.
And you clearly did.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun along the way. We got our nose broken a couple of times, but the relationships were always really strong and all based on respect.
It was a really interesting point that you make here around dealing with 5 chiefs over that large area. You, over your journey, have become now very well connected within Namibia, and you've been involved in quite significant associations. One being, for example, the Namibian Uranium Association from 2010 to 2015. I know when you finished up with Bannerman on the first run, because of the Fukushima result, they asked you to remain on that association to stay in touch with that group. Is that right?
Yeah, they asked me to stay on as governance advisor and to stay on as a trustee.
Yes.
The nice thing about going into a country like Namibia, which has such a small population, is that if you've got a few skills and you're happy to throw them around voluntarily, you get people asking you to do stuff.
Yes.
And that's just an example. And I was only too happy to do it, and I had a few skills and I had a bit of knowledge, and obviously governance was something that was integrally involved in my legal career. And so I could make myself useful.
But this is extended on to you became a strategic advisor with the Namibian Mining Charter for the Chamber of Mines of Namibia, to the extent where you were a co-author of the Namibian Mining Charter.
Yes.
With the Prime Minister of the time.
Yeah, so myself and an economist, Robin Sherborne, authored the Namibian Mining Charter. So for people who don't follow Southern Africa closely, that's basically a voluntary industry code which is designed to bridge the gap between Namibia's legislative system and government and community expectations, predominantly to do with empowerment. So it was a very significant exercise in multi-party negotiation. We had to get all of the key stakeholders within the Chamber of Mines on one page, and then we had to negotiate it with government. And we ended up with a range of voluntary requirements that formed the mining charter. So, for example, 5% local ownership in any mining company.
Yes.
And that ultimately found its way into a standing set of conditions that apply to mining licenses. Minimum of 20% of previously disadvantaged Namibians need to be in management, genuine, authentic management. A minimum contribution towards social programs and corporate social responsibility and what we now call ESG. A range of training initiatives. And we had a scoring system. So you would score, and if you're a bit weak on one side, then you could make it up in another way so that there would be a balanced contribution. And that was a fascinating exercise because we had so many different diverse stakeholders. And it was really an exercise in risk mitigation from both the government side of the fence and also from our perspective.
Yes.
Because what we had to say to our members in the Chamber of Mines was, listen, if we do nothing here, then we're forcing government to come in and adopt what's been done in South Africa, which is legislated black economic empowerment. And equally, the government knew that that didn't work. They were well aware that it has been a failure in most respects in South Africa, so they didn't want to do it, but they needed something that they could show their constituency to say, no, well, we are making progress here, and the mining industry is interested and passionate and willing to contribute at a community level and try and start making tangible steps towards redressing what still to this day is a significant hangover from the apartheid era. And so, yeah, we had lots of amazing experiences as part of that journey, like locked in a room with the Prime Minister for a whole weekend trying to thrash things out and having that really fascinating access to the way that government thought as well. Because often as a miner, you're very positional with your attitudes because you're defending the whole time against government, whereas being there working hand in hand with government and understanding right from the politician's mouth the pressures that they're under to deliver and the misunderstandings in the community.
Yes.
So just as an example, the average community member, they see a big yellow truck that's probably the biggest piece of equipment they've ever come across, and they don't realise that for a mining company, all that represents is debt and responsibility and the potential reminder of catastrophic failure. They just assume that's an asset, and if you can own one of those, you must be so rich.
Yeah.
And they don't even necessarily understand corporate structures. So if they see me standing in front of a truck like that, they assume that I must be that rich.
Right.
And they cannot for the life of them understand why I'm not more free with my money.
Yes.
So there's lots of misunderstandings like that you get in Africa that you learn to address, and you learn to manage expectations, and understanding where government comes from and the immense pressures that the ministers are under, not from industry, but for their own political survival or for their own passion in the way that they're trying to represent their people. That was really formulative for me.
Oh, well, I mean, what a feather in your cap to have actually achieved that and have that in place. But what it does provide you, and for the listener, we'll fast forward to 2016 when Brandon returns to Bannerman, which is now called Bannerman Energy, as the managing director and CEO. Now, armed with that relationship base within the Namibian government, armed with the fact you're now part of their Uranium Association, armed with your understanding of nuclear and so much more as to the way that the mining of and exploration of Namibia is about to unfold under your tutelage within Bannerman, things start to develop. Okay, and you go on to join the World Nuclear Association in terms of your role with Bannerman, and then now you're a strategic, or you're an advisory panel member of that. And you were there as 4 years as a co-chair, correct?
Of one of their working groups.
Yes.
So the World Nuclear Association, it's really the pivotal umbrella organisation for the civil nuclear industry around the world.
Right.
And they have a number of working groups, and their flagship publication, which is released every 2 years, is the Nuclear Fuel Report. And one of the things that publication presents is forecasted nuclear fuel demand and supply out to 2040. And the committee or the working group that was required to forecast the demand profiles across 3 different scenarios was the body that I co-chaired for 4 years.
And that would have been just so insightful.
Oh, tremendous. I mean, not only for the access to data, but the access to different perspectives from within the industry.
Yes.
The recovery of the uranium price has been a very vexed question over a long period of time. And for most of that period of time since 2016, I've been a dramatic exposed outlier in terms of my views on what uranium would need to do. And, happily for our shareholders, I'm no longer the outlier.
Yes.
But the depth of understanding and knowledge required to maintain that public position in the face of significant ridicule along the journey was really important. And understanding at the coalface what the key industry players thought and why they thought that it wasn't going to recover, and being able to have these bear case scenarios constantly in front of me on this committee, that was a great way of sense checking what my expectations were in our own forecasting and our own modelling. And it's only through meticulously working our way through all of those objections or all of those views and either weighting them or saying, well, we don't agree, and we can get to the point where we don't agree for good reasons. That's what maintained that confidence. So in 2017, when uranium was trading at about $22, and I stood up at a conference and I said, uranium will have to get up to $80 and above before we see any new production come in, and we're absolutely convinced it will. I had those experiences behind me to enable me to be foolish enough to stand up and do that in that price environment. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, Brandon, over the period of time, and from 2016, you are now in a position with Bannerman through their Atango project. You're now fully permitted, and you're on an aim to produce 3.5 million pounds. The price is now over 100. So, you come back to where you were then, and where you are now. Now, I suppose for the listener, just give us a little bit of an insight into why this growth has occurred. And we're talking about 16 when you started. We're now end of 23. So it's been a 7-year journey. You know, not all been easy. In fact, you could say that probably the last couple of years or year has been the highlight. But you know what I mean? So just give us a bit of an insight into what you've been able to see yourself through to get to this point. And I know you're very excited about what the future holds and what the prospects are for the company. But that journey has been quite something.
It really has. And I was reflecting on this just recently because at the end of next week, it will have been 8 years since I was appointed CEO.
Right, okay.
Which I think for anyone these days is a decent time at the wicket. And for much of that time, it was really tough. When I came in 2016, fairly quickly we realised that we would need to do a capital raising. Nobody wanted to talk uranium. Nobody wanted to talk uranium investment. I had to lean on the brokers that I had personal accounts with, sort of butter them up by doing a whole lot of trading just to push a little bit of revenue through their accounts. And then I had the balls to ask them if they wouldn't mind just coming and humouring me with a 20-minute session on Bannerman. And it was really that tough. But by the end of the year, we managed to raise, and we raised well, and we've raised well ever since. And the reason why I was able to do that was through my experience since 2009 and also with the concerted injection of effort, I was able to make the calls and say, look, here I am. I've popped up again with Bannerman. I'd like to come and just give you a refresher on the uranium sector. It's only 20 minutes. Refresher on the uranium sector. I promise you won't waste your time. And so I'd talk to brokers and fund managers and analysts and anyone who really would take the call.
Yes.
About what was happening in the uranium sector. And people appreciated that. And they appreciated that I didn't try and sell them the Bannerman, but at least the next time when I went back, they were interested in the update, and maybe they'd ask a question or two about Bannerman.
It's been an educational role, really. Would you say that to the external parties? You really have just been an educator in the area of uranium and its role within the broader space of power and energy.
Yeah, I've realised that that's my passion. There's an enormous gap. Going back to where I started with this, where my whole understanding of this sector was based on myths and mistruths, that's helped me understand that that's still where a lot of people are. And the great tragedy that we face at the moment is there's a very broad awareness at different levels of credibility that we face a climate challenge or a climate crisis, depending on how worried you are about the impacts and whether they can be mitigated. So everyone's talking about climate mitigation and decarbonisation. But the level of energy literacy amongst the community is appalling. It's appalling. So that's a little bit like saying, right, we've got to go to war, but no one knows what a gun is, or no one knows what an army is, or what a soldier is, or no one's even heard of a war before. That's the comparison. People's understanding out there in the general community about grid economics and energy systems and everything beneath the headlines about power is diabolical, and it's not taught at all at school. Now, so a lot of what I'm doing, it's different with sophisticated investors, of course, and energy investors and resources investors, but the public generally out there really doesn't understand this, and that's where they need to start. We can't possibly have an energy policy driven by politicians who are representing their constituents if their constituents don't have a clue what all this means.
And would you say the politicians have an understanding?
It varies.
Right.
And I'm an apolitical person. I'm not a member of any political party. I've voted literally across the spectrum as an adult. But I will say this, Ted O'Brien has got a very sound and a very detailed understanding. And I've been talking to him about nuclear energy and uranium for at least the last 4 years. So he's got a sophisticated, realistic, accurate understanding of energy economics.
Right.
And for people who don't know, maybe they're tuning in from overseas or something, he is an opposition MP, Liberal Party MP, who is the shadow energy and climate minister.
if we could just actually now focus on Bannerman and what your understanding of now, let's just, if we pivoted a little bit to the left and we started talking about lithium and how they're, as they grow, as you set up the infrastructure, the offtake agreements are in place. With Bannerman Energy, you're about to embark on, getting the construction phase happening. You're looking to move into production, and that production you're hoping to be somewhere in the 2027 bracket.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about your understanding of those sort of clients, the end clients of Bannerman at the end, in terms of who will be receiving the product, the uranium that you're digging up at the end. So just we can see a bit of the whole flow chart.
Yeah, so look, most fundamentally, uranium is only commercially mined for nuclear power. Okay, so there's a whole lot of treaties and a whole lot of laws and an enormous amount of organisational structure around the world that make sure that no uranium that's mined will go into weapons. So this conversation is only about nuclear power.
Yes.
And so our customers will be large power utilities who have either a large or partial emphasis on nuclear power, and they will exist in most of the world. The main exception being Russia. So we won't be selling any of our uranium to Russia, and that's, I think, very clear for most Western uranium producers now because of what's happened in the world and the world of geopolitics. But that still leaves some very large customers in the US, which is about 25% of the current nuclear fleet around the world. China, which will very soon be about 25% of the nuclear fleet around the world. South Korea is a very big customer potentially for us. Europe, Japan, and a host of emerging nuclear power nations such as the UAE, who've just completed a 5.6 gigawatt nuclear power station at Baraka. So it's fairly broad and fairly diverse. What the customers particularly like about Etango and our project is that the world of uranium has become very concentrated, both geographically concentrated. So 10 countries produce 95% of the world's uranium. 4 countries, including Namibia, produce more than half of the world's uranium. So it's enormously concentrated. Outside of, say, cobalt, it's really hard to find another energy metal that's got that level of concentration. But it's also very commercially concentrated. You've really got 3 commercial companies that produce almost all of the market. So the nuclear utilities around the world, they want to see a greater choice. They want to see diversification, and being in Namibia and being a new entrant into the market, that's exactly what they want right now. And you talked about £3.5 million. That is our initial level of production. For people getting their eye in, that's enough to service, say, 7 to 8 conventional nuclear power reactors, or 7 to 8,000 megawatts of power. It's
Right.
an enormous amount of power that we can produce. It's more power than many, many countries require for their whole nation from the uranium that we would produce. But on top of that, we've got the potential to expand and double that. So over time, we'd expect to be expanding that from £3.5 million. We get into production, we get profitable, we pay the bank back, and then we look at expanding that production to 7, which doubles that output and doubles that influence that we can have.
Gosh, it's fascinating. You're going to be the 4th producing uranium mine in Namibia?
Yes, we expect to be.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
There's very shortly there'll be 3 producing mines. Langer Heinrich, we understand, is doing really well on coming back into production. So that would be 3 producing mines, and we would anticipate being the 4th.
Because, I mean, coming back to it, Namibia's got a history of something like 45 years of being in uranium production.
And that's a huge advantage.
Yeah.
Huge advantage. And in some ways that you wouldn't expect. So, for example, I think it's fairly intuitive to people that if uranium mining's been around there for 45 years, that the local community's not only got used to it, but come to understand its benefits.
Yes.
And when someone goes to Swakopmund, you have a look around the town and you see, well, a lot of the infrastructure in the town, a lot of the great stuff about Swakopmund's been built on the back of Rio operating the Rossing uranium mine for so long.
Yes.
But there's some other things that might not be so obvious. So the regulators' impact on running a uranium mine is absolutely immense. You have to have a competent regulator who can not only make sure that you're held accountable as a mining company, but also can interface with all of the treaty obligations that that country must have. They need to interface with the International Atomic Energy Agency. They need to interface on security, on non-proliferation treaties. There's a vast web of multilateral regulatory requirements, and you have to have sophistication in your host country to be able to do that. Now, normally in Africa, and particularly for a small country like Namibia, that would be a really big ask.
Yes.
But they've been doing it for 45 years.
They know how to do it.
They know how to do it.
Yeah.
They're not scared of it. They're realistic about it. They're pragmatic about it. They know how to get the right outcomes. So that's a tremendous advantage that might not be obvious to a lot of people listening in.
Gosh, we could talk about this for a long time, Brandon. For the listener, you can just see the passion Brandon's got for talking about his subject of choice, which is, in this case is uranium and the power of nuclear. It is really fascinating, and I am learning all the time from what you're just throwing across the table. But as I say, we could talk for hours. I look at it and go, right, well, for you, what's going forward for you? You know, you're taking Bannerman Energy to where it is now. What are the next stages for the growth trajectory of Brandon Munro?
Well, we've just announced some fairly formulative changes at Bannerman. As you've been hearing about my background, I haven't built a mine before. And I've been long saying to the board, when we get to the point that we're ready to build a mine, the person running the company must have that experience. The investors will expect that. The financiers will expect that. So we've just announced that I'll move to chairman.
Right.
And I'm really proud and really pleased that Gavin Chamberlain, who's been our chief operating officer for the last year, will come in and step in as CEO. So in some respects, it's not a big change for me. I'll just be redirecting my time from some of the more operational aspects into some of the more strategic aspects. I'll remain market-facing, remain with the investor relations, remain with contacts into the nuclear industry and so on. But it means that Gavin, who is a proven mine builder with more than 30 years of experience, he's now running the company, and he's the one who's going to take it forward on our most critical mission, which is building the mine, building it on time, building it on budget, and building it without incident.
Yes.
And just as an example, he was the project director who built the Husab uranium mine in Namibia. And that was a mine that was almost an order of magnitude greater in terms of capital cost. It was significantly more complex than what a Tango is. So for him now to run the company that's building a Tango, investors can be really confident that it's deeply within his competence, as well as a whole bunch of other really nice attributes that he brings.
Fantastic. Well, good luck with that part of it. I mean, what I do detect though is that this is a strategic decision within the company, but you are going on to, I would say, enhance your role really in terms of your role within the company, allowing for Gavin to take on that pivot in the company's progress.
Well, it's exactly that.
Yeah.
What it means for me, both from a shareholder perspective, but also personally, is I can dedicate all of my time to doing what I'm actually not bad at doing, the things that are strengths of mine.
Yes.
As you can imagine, when I came in 2016, it was a bit of a startup in some respects. We only had 7 people in the organisation, and as CEO, you know, I even felt like an imposter calling myself CEO of such a small organisation at that stage. But the point is that I was doing everything that wasn't done by my PA or my accountant or our management team in Namibia. And I've had to kind of, as we're getting on a much greater growth path, within a couple of years we'll have 500 employees in the organisation. So this gives me the opportunity to wean myself away from all of those startup type, generalist type, Man Friday type jobs that I've had to do,
yes,
to now be far more focused on what I'm actually good at. And with Gavin focused on what he's good at. And the nice thing is the things that, you know, have never really been my strength, like the HR and managing people and so on, he's a master at that. He's a wizard at getting the most out of people, at developing people. And it's just such a win for everyone, including Gavin.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. Well, I'm just conscious of time. I just wanted to quickly move to the left a little bit and talk about family. You know, married, you've got 2 daughters, 10 and 11.
Yep.
Keeping you entertained?
Yeah, like they're in that beautiful phase where they still think I'm kind of all right.
Good, yeah. And you spend a bit of time with them. You know, you obviously got to travel a little bit, but, you know, are you working through that work-life balance, Brandon?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't buy into the idea of a work-life balance. I think if you're in a corporate role trying to actually balance just never works. It's more like a work-life integration.
Yes.
And yes, I do travel a lot. Yes, I push out a few hours, but I do have a lot of flexibility. So just an example, I travel a lot, but when I can, if it's school holidays, I'll see if I can bridge that with them joining us. And they spent a bit of time in France in January when I was in between work engagements in the Northern Hemisphere. It didn't make sense for me to come down to Perth. And it was school holidays, so they were happy to come up, and we spent some beautiful time on the snow together.
Well, they won't forget that.
No, and so you've just got to make it work, but there's no substitute for time and kids. You know, the whole idea of being a breadwinner who can put money on the table, they're just not interested in that. That's not what makes them tick. It has to be time. And that's always been the challenge, but so far I've been able to make that work.
Oh, good on you. And thanks for sharing that. It's really insightful. The idea around you and where you ultimately want to end up, is it sort of like, what's the end goal for Brandon Munro? You know, do you want to just end up being, if you can see the Bannerman Energy through, is it to be a chairman on other boards, or is it to remain with Bannerman for the extended period of time?
Look, it's definitely to remain with Bannerman for the journey. You know, we want to be standing on the edge of the mine in whatever form that takes.
Yes.
This has become a fairly personal journey for me, dating back to 2009. But you know, you could even say there's a bit of an intergenerational aspect.
Yes.
To getting the mine built. We're a listed company, so exactly the financing structure of that mine is still quite open. But seeing that mine through to development and ensuring that those jobs are created and that benefit goes into the community, you know, that's about as close to spiritual as I get.
Good on you.
And so that's something that's tangible. It's in the close to medium term. It's something I can lock onto. I've never been a big sort of long distance planner in terms of setting career goals. So I've always had some thematics in my career, and equity markets is one of those. Being driven by passion and purpose is another, and that's one of the really great privileges of what I've been able to do since 2009. I've been able to do something I really enjoy, something that I feel at the end of most weeks has a positive impact, but also it's very online with feeling like I'm making a difference. And it's hard to imagine something that gives you more personal power to influence the globe in a positive way than bringing a big uranium mine onto production. Like, just think about this for a moment. £3.5 million, right? So that's 7,000 to 8,000 megawatts of electricity. Almost certainly the bulk of that will be used to displace coal, particularly if our key customers are in China. So the carbon impact of that, 3.5 million pounds of uranium would displace 25 million tonnes of coal every year. Now, to help people understand what sort of an impact this is,
wow.
If you took I was talking to a North American audience about this recently, so I put it in their context. It's like taking a train, a single coal train, and loading that up. And one train would stretch all the way from New York to Los Angeles and halfway back. And we're doing that every year. It's a colossal difference. The carbon impact of that is absolutely profound. So I get out of bed in the morning, like, just imagine being me for a minute. I get out of bed in the morning and I'm leading a company that's about to have that difference on the planet, as well as creating 750 primary jobs for people who really need it in Namibia. And that's probably got a leveraged effect of creating another 5,000 secondary jobs. So there's something really special. It's a pinch yourself moment to realise you actually get paid for doing that. So that's given me a taste for being on purpose and a taste for having a high impact. And that's the thematic that I really want to carry forward. And I definitely can't see myself retiring. Like, it would be such a waste. So for as long as I've got an astute mind and I've got a pair of legs that carry me around the place, that's the thematic that I want to continue with my career and my life.
What a great answer. Thank you so much. And for the listener, that you could just see Brandon lighting up. And I'll just say to I suppose bring this to a conclusion, this has been an enlightening conversation. You are really, really, and you covered it just then, and it was something I was going to mention, but I'll mention it. Passion, drive, hard work, and you put it all together, and you can tell that it's starting to click in terms of you've been through some uncertain times. It's coming through the other side, and you can see that passion and the reward that's coming through out of that, but that the light is there, and you can see the end and how it may look. And those analogies around the comparisons of what you've been able to potentially achieve for the world, if it all goes according to plan, is frightening, really. It's amazing. So good on you and well done. And look, again, thanks a lot for taking the time out to join us on Finding the Front. On behalf of all of us at Euroz Hartleys, we really do appreciate it. And you're one of those guys, Brandon, that's been, as you said, educating people in the area of uranium for a long period of time. You've clearly got a love of family and you've got a love of what you do, but it's not been easy. And here you are, and it's great to be able to have a chat to you when we've got a lot to look forward to. So thanks.
Thanks, Jim. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Good on you. Thanks, mate.
Thanks for listening to Euroz Hartleys Finding the Front. This podcast is for general information purposes only. Please check out eurozhartleys.com for more information. Euroz Hartleys holds Australian Financial Services Licence 230052.